Transition now from collective grief of Ela Ezkara to the individual grief and mourning with our Yizkor service. Sholem Asch's Yiddish novel entitled Kiddush Hashem, Sanctification of God's Name, describes the frightful massacre of Jews in 17th century Poland. Shlomo is one of very few survivors of the decimated Jewish section of his city of Lublin, and here is how his novel ends. In Lublin, he came across refugees from other towns, and he learned from some of the forced conversions, of the death of his own father and mother who had died for Kiddush Hashem, for the sanctification of God's name. But he didn't know what became of Devorah, his Devorah. He imagined that she had gone up to heaven in holiness and purity. In heaven she must be, and in heaven she would be waiting for him. He did not mourn her. Only a great longing for her took possession of him, and for the day when he could be again with her. And so he roamed through the city streets and found his way to a fair in the city of Lublin, a fair among refugees, among husbands separated from their wives and wives separated from their husbands, among the widows and the orphans. He heard the sighs and the moaning of his people, which rose up above, hovered above the fair. He pondered deeply on the matter and sought to understand the meaning of it all. For a minute, the meaning escaped him. He could not understand, and he fell into a state of depression, and this caused him to fall into deep grief, for it is a matter of common knowledge that depression is only 1 degree removed from doubting. And then, when he was wandering through the narrow streets, there were merchant stalls, all lining up along the streets, and he saw standing before him an empty booth with an old man who was calling out to buyers to come into his booth. Shlomo marveled greatly at this scene. Why? Because his booth was completely empty. There was nothing in it to sell. Shlomo walked into the booth and asked the old man, "What do you sell here? Your booth is completely empty. There's no merchandise." And the old man answered him, "Here I sell faith." Shlomo looked intently at the old man, and the old man suddenly appeared to be familiar, as though he had seen him before. When I read this scene of the fair in Lublin and the market stall selling faith to mourners, I thought it could only be a scene from long ago and far away. But this year I saw the scene with my very own eyes. When I went to Israel in November and then again in February, I went to a place in Tel Aviv, not a fair. It is now called Hostage Square. It began as a makeshift place for families of the hostages to sit in tents so that people could come and comfort them, or just sit silently with them and wait with them. In early days, it was a place for hostage families to exchange information, scraps of intelligence about what had happened and what might still happen if they were lucky. Then came the artist installations. Many of you have seen them. Then came a long cement tunnel, a replica of the ones in underground Gaza, so visitors can experience just for a moment the heavy darkness in such a fearful place. And then there was something altogether different. Thanks to Reform and conservative rabbis, Hostage Square has become a prayerful place as well. They open up an area like a market stall, and they sell faith. You see, Some of the hostage families come from staunchly secular backgrounds. They had no prayer practice, but now they gather each week for Havdalah and songful prayer. I heard one mother plead with my friend, the rabbi, saying, "Please, teach me to pray. I don't know how, and I am desperate to pray now." These two stories, separated by 400 years, are mirror images of one another, and they come to teach us that mourning and faith are inevitably bound together. Whether it is a horrific loss like the one Shalom Ash describes, or like the one our people has experienced on and since October 7th, or a so-called typical loss, when a dear one slips into deep, a typical loss, the loss we might even wish for, when a dear one slips into death peacefully after a good long life. In every instance of loss, there is no avoiding the questions of faith. What is the traditional blessing spoken when hearing about a death? Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. Praised be the judge of truth. Just 3 words in the Hebrew, the shortest bracha of all, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. With these 3 holy words, we turn immediately from the one who has died to God. Why do we do this? Our first impulse when hearing of a death is to acknowledge God, to call attention to God's power when we feel powerless, to acknowledge that God only knows when our knowledge runs out. We cannot see beyond this life. We cannot understand the death we have witnessed. And so with humility, we acknowledge God as the true judge of life and death and forever. In the shadow of death, we feel smaller, and we are able to feel God's vastness in a way we may not have known since childhood. That feeling that everything and everyone surrounding us is bigger than we are and louder than we are, and we go quiet. As mourners, we have these spiritual insights, these spiritual longings. As mourners, we grow more aware of God at work in our lives. You might assume that mourners are estranged from God, distanced from God, but usually I find it's just the opposite. Usually, mourners are the ones closest to God, or trying to draw closer to God. I see it all the time when I am with you who mourn. Why do many people suddenly become more observant of ritual when a loved one dies? People who normally do not stop for rituals of Jewish life suddenly stop everything to sit Shiva, to cut Kriya, to cover the mirrors, to light candles. Those who typically do not gravitate to sanctuaries are suddenly reciting Kaddish daily, missing work for Yizkor, rushing to make the minyan. This sudden shift can take the mourner by surprise. But it makes perfect sense, doesn't it? It is evidence of how our longings for our dear one has everything to do with our longings for God. If the soul of our loved one is now somehow bound up in the realm of the divine, then we long to draw nearer to them both. Why else do mourners lean into matters of the Spirit? Because when we were with our loved one in life, we felt loved and protected and confident. Now that they are gone from this life, we naturally feel drawn to seek out God's love, God's protection, God's reassurances. When mourners are overwhelmed with an aching spirit or shattered by anger or gripped by a constant longing, they become unusually capable of making new room in their lives for God. They go searching for the market stall where faith is being given away for free. We must presume that mourners who distance themselves from God, who had a loved one taken from them from this life and brought into the next. But it seems more often than not, mourners become acutely aware that God, who has taken our dear ones from us, is also the one who gave us life in the very first place. What other insights can mourners access more easily than the rest of us? They become especially aware of the simple truth that the heartbreak of loss is the price we pay for having loved and for having been loved. And if we had to choose between this heartbreak after love or the heartbreak of never having known love at all, we would choose this loss every time. If we had to choose between a life with and then without the one we mourn, or a life never knowing them, we would choose this grief again and again. Armed with this clarity, you who mourn are surprisingly strong in character and growing stronger in faith. Our Yom Kippur removes the veil between the worlds of the living and the worlds of the dead. That veil becomes more transparent, less opaque when we sit quietly in sacred community, in sacred space, in sacred time. God says, I create worlds and I bring back the dead to life. So are you human beings capable of doing the same. This moment of Yizkor is such a moment.